By 32 BC, the Roman Republic was grappling with weakened republican structures, increasingly dominated by powerful generals. Real power rested with two men, Octavian in the west and Mark Antony in the east. Once allies under the Second Triumvirate, their cooperation had crumbled into rivalry. Antony, ruling from Alexandria with Cleopatra VII, was portrayed in Rome as a man bewitched by the East. Cleopatra, queen of Egypt and mother of Caesar's son Caesarion, now reigned as co-sovereign. When Antony divorced Octavia, Octavian's sister, the propaganda machine turned in full. Rome was headed for war. While Rome held to the illusion of republicanism, the true authority belonged to generals who commanded legions and controlled provinces. Antony and Octavian, heirs to Caesar's fractured vision, had once shared power under the Second Triumvirate, but the alliance was always uneasy. Antony had military prestige and eastern wealth, while Octavian had Caesar's name and the loyalty of Italy. The tipping point came when Antony's relationship with Cleopatra eclipsed his duties to Rome. To Octavian and to the Roman Senate and the people, this was a portrayal of Roman values, fueling calls for war. Antony and Cleopatra's political and romantic alliance had once been a symbol of East-West cooperation, but by 32 BC, it had become the target of Rome's deepest anxieties. Cleopatra was painted as a dangerous foreign queen manipulating a Roman noble. This narrative ignored her intellect, statecraft, and economic importance. Her reign had stabilized Egypt, restored temples, and expanded trade routes. Yet Octavian's messaging reduced her to a seductress and painted Antony as her pawn. The reality was far more complex. Cleopatra was a shrewd ruler whose alliance with Antony aimed to secure Egypt's power and influence in a fracturing Roman world. Antony and Cleopatra amassed a formidable force, over 500 ships, primarily large quinqueremes and large polyremes. About 60,000 infantry was with them. They anchored at Actium, a promontory on the western coast of Greece. Octavian, guided by his admiral Agrippa, assembled a faster, more mobile force of roughly 400 Liberian vessels. Agrippa quickly sieged the nearby ports, cutting off Antony's grain supplies and trapping the larger fleet inside the Abyssinian Gulf. Cleopatra's navy was not merely supplemental, it was central. Her treasuries funded much of the Eastern war effort. Egyptian grain, silver, and manpower ensured Antony could field the fleet of this scale. The ships themselves were imposing, some said to be floating fortresses, but the size came at a cost. They lacked maneuverability, and many were undermanned due to malaria and desertions, and their deep drafts were ill-suited for the narrow waterways near Actium. Octavian's fleet, though smaller, was more agile. Agrippa capitalized on this difference, turning his Liberians' speed and maneuverability into a decisive advantage by outflanking Antony's cumbersome fleet and tightening the blockade. Beyond its tactical implications, the military buildup at Actium reflected the broader divide between two visions of Roman power. Antony's camp was multicultural and dynastic. Cleopatra did not just fund the fleet. She symbolized an alternative model for sovereignty. Her children, with Antony, were named rulers of eastern provinces in the donations of Alexandria. Though denounced in Rome, these moves were welcomed by many in the Hellenistic world. In contrast, Octavian's military machine was tightly centralized, relying on decades of Italian infrastructure, and loyalist veterans promised land and spoils for their service. His ability to maintain supply lines, discipline, and morale spoke to a unified Roman identity rooted in order and law, however tenuous that idea may have become. Actium's geography dictated the battle. The Ambracian Gulf was a narrow inlet bordered by straits and hills. Antony's ships formed a blockade across the mouth. Cleopatra's fleet, stationed in reserve, remained behind the front lines. Octavian's lighter vessels stayed mobile and avoided direct engagement. Agrippa's strategy relied on speed and maneuverability, using experienced crews in swift ships to isolate and overwhelm the bulkier eastern vessels. The scale of Antony's warships was both impressive and problematic. While his largest ships could carry towers, archers, and ballistas, they were still ill-suited for the confined waters of the Ambracian Gulf. Their turning radius was poor, and many were undermanned due to disease and desertion. Plutarch recorded that Antony ordered excess ships burned due to lacks of crews. Cleopatra's ships were heavier than Octavian's Liberians. Octavian's crews had trained for years in Illyrian raids and piracy suppression, giving them the edge in close-quarter maneuvers. Agrippa ordered feints and reconnaissance missions in the days leading up to the battle, mapping the enemy's formation and currents. Every detail was calculated. Antony, for his part, remained indecisive, torn between breaking the blockade and waiting for reinforcements that would never arrive. On the morning of September 2, 31 BC, both sides engaged. Antony led from the center. Cleopatra's ships stayed behind. Octavian's wings closed in. The sea filled with the crashing of hulls, the crack of rounds, and the screams of boarding parties. Boarding actions turned decks into battlegrounds. Agrippa's right flank drove hard into Antony's left. The eastern ships, powerful but sluggish, struggled to reposition. Antony fought valiantly, but the battle began to tip. The engagement itself unfolded slowly. Antony's forces attempted to force a breakthrough in the center while holding the flanks. Octavian lines held firm. Agrippa, meanwhile, launched the concentrated attacks on Antony's vulnerable edges, driving wedges into his formations. What Antony's fleet had in strength, it lacked in cohesion. Orders were slow to transmit, ships blocked one another's movements, and many commanders hesitated in the fog of war. Meanwhile, Agrippa's Liburnians struck with precision, ramming, boarding, and isolating vessels with disciplined force, exploiting the disarray in Antony's lines to steadily dismantle his fleet's cohesion. Suddenly, Cleopatra broke from the rear and escaped eastward. Her departure stunned Antony's command. Whether coordinated or impulsive, it was decisive. Antony, seeing her flee, abandoned the battle and pursued her. His fleet, left leaderless, collapsed. Ships were boarded, scuttled, or captured. Octavian's forces took the Gulf. Victory was complete. Octavian did not pursue immediately. He spent months securing the region and absorbing surrendering forces. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt. Over the next year, their position crumbled. Allies abandoned them. In 30 BC, Octavian invaded. Antony committed suicide, believing Cleopatra dead. She followed days later, and her son Caesarion was captured and executed. Egypt became a Roman province. Even after their defeat, Antony and Cleopatra remained defiant symbols of resistance. Cleopatra attempted diplomacy from Alexandria, seeking to preserve Egypt's autonomy or at least protect her children. Only Caesarion was executed. Her other children, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, were spared. She knew Octavian's ambitions and the propaganda that would follow if she were paraded through Rome in chains. Her suicide was not just an escape, it was a final act of political control. In death, she denied Octavian the victory display that had followed so many conquests. Her suicide became her final act of political defiance, denying Octavian the satisfaction of parading her in chains through the streets of Rome. In the months that followed, Egypt fell quietly into Octavian's hands. Resistance was minimal. Many local officials, having seen Cleopatra's fate, capitulated to Roman authority. Octavian spared some of Cleopatra's loyal courtiers and absorbed Egyptian administrators into his own bureaucracy. Alexandria, once a rival to Rome in wealth and culture, became a jewel of the new empire. The Library of Alexandria survived, though diminished, and its scholars now served Roman interests. Octavian looted Cleopatra's archives and treasure houses, transferring their knowledge and riches to Roman control. Egypt's vast wealth bolstered Rome's economy, while its administrative structure were repurposed to serve the new imperial order, cementing Octavian's dominance. Octavian immortalized his victory. He founded Nicopolis, built the Temple of Apollo, and minted coins celebrating Actium. Agrippa's key role, though underplayed in propaganda, remained crucial. He continued to serve as consul and oversaw major projects under Augustus. Octavian took the glory. Antony was vilified. Cleopatra became the symbol of Eastern decadence in Roman eyes, though many in the eastern provinces admired her Hellenistic vision of rule. The narrative was clear. Roman discipline had triumphed over foreign corruption. The memory of Actium lived on. Long after the battle ended, Octavian's political genius lay in transforming a messy civil war into a sacred narrative. He adopted the title Augustus in 27 BC, aligning himself with divine order and presenting the Principate as the restoration rather than a revolution. Actium was depicted in art, coinage, and poetry as a clash between virtue and decadence, discipline and indulgence, Rome and the East. But the simplification hid deeper truths. The empire Augustus built would come to embrace many of the cultural institutions Antony and Cleopatra championed. Hellenistic architecture, Eastern cult, and dynastic succession. The East was not defeated, it was absorbed, and Actium became less of a conquest and more of a convergence. Actium was more than a sea battle. It was a culmination of the Republic's long erosion, including Caesar's dictatorship and the years of proscriptions. Antony and Cleopatra envisioned an alternative empire. Octavian offered stability, order, and a new beginning. Rome chose Octavian, and with him, Rome chose an empire. Actium made Augustus. Actium marked a symbolic end to republican governance. Though Augustus retained its forms while concentrating real power in himself, its institutions persisted in name, but their function now served the princeps. Actium was more than a culmination of civil war. It was a symbolic transition point. where Rome moved irrevocably from republic to empire. With Cleopatra's defeat, the last major resistance to Octavian's consolidation vanished. The notion of shared rule, of senatorial authority, and checks and balances, these ideals faded with the sails on that bloodied sea. In their place rose a new regime, not through legislative reform, but through calculated violence and absolute control. Augustus, born from victory at Actium, crafted a new imperial order that reshaped Rome's identity. The political theater surrounding Actium shaped Roman identity for generations. The Senate, though outwardly restored, became a ceremonial body. Augustus held tribunician power and imperium maius authority over all military commands without bearing monarchical titles. It was a system of masks where the illusion of republicanism concealed imperial control. Antony and Cleopatra's defeat became a myth of moral failure rather than a lost alternative to Augustus's centralization. Yet in the echoes of the Eastern Mediterranean, Cleopatra's legacy would persist in monuments, in memory, and in the shape of the empire she failed to bend to her will.